So hi everybody, welcome to the sixth in the LexRex Trusted Partner series of webinars. My name is Victoria Moffat. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the founder and managing director of LexRex Communications. LexRex Communications is a PR and communications consultancy for the legal sector. So sort of way back now, it seems forever ago, back in April, when everything was just completely hideous and everybody was panicking, myself included, about where to get loo roll from. We sort of decided and realised as a team that that PR and comms and marketing sadly was very, very, very low down in the list of kind of people's survival plans when it came to our clients and to law firms in general. So that's what led us to create Trusted Partner. And Trusted Partner is essentially a series of fortnightly webinars whereby we invite our trusted partners, people that we know, people that we like, and people that we trust, to come and talk to us about the issues that we know that law firms are sort of struggling with right now. So I'm very, very pleased to invite Mary Dovey to come and speak to us today. It's the usual format. It's quite an informal chat, and we're going to be talking about kind of the HR issues and the HR matters that you should consider if you are looking at bringing some, or maybe one or two, or maybe all of your staff back into the office. And I was going to say something then, I completely can't remember what it was, so I'm going to pass over to Mary to introduce herself.
Thank you, Victoria, and it's a pleasure to be asked to participate in this webinar with LexRex Comms, if that's correct. I hope I've got that right.
Yeah. That is right.
Good. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for taking time out to participate in this webinar. I'm founder and owner of Your People Matter, which is a HR consultancy and also workplace mediation support business, and I've been running for about 3 years now, and prior to that I was always employed in various roles, not just HR. Actually started in finance, but moving on to HR right up to Deputy HR Director in both private and non-private organisations, some unionised, some not. So there are 3 strands to my business effectively, and I'll just be brief about that. I deal predominantly with employee relations matters. So I was just saying to Victoria this morning, the phone's gone mad this morning about things on top of COVID. If you haven't got enough to deal with, you've also got some other things that predominantly will carry on that you perhaps need advice around. Change management is my speciality. So anything involving change, and not least, we're all facing that right now. That's my speciality in terms of how can you manage those change elements without disengaging your workforce, but at the same time running your business. And lastly, workplace mediation. So where you might have members of your team who aren't getting on, I help them find a platform to start finding a way to get on, thus stop affecting the rest of your team, because often it can have an impact, and also productivity. So that's what I do. So my main focus is to try and get in early and advise people so that you're not faced with situations where you're having to go backwards. So for me, it's all about prevention, and it's better to ask the questions early than late, often where employment law is concerned, even if it's just to confirm that you're on the right path. That's what
that sounds good to me. Okie doke. So that's us two. So I think briefly today, we are going to be talking about planning, then compliance, and then sort of the longer term changes that you need to kind of make or consider or review. Is that about right?
Absolutely. So really, just very short, effectively those 3 areas could make up a webinar in themselves. So we'll be trying to provide you with as much guidance and make that as practical as possible. Now, obviously, recognising your business is going to be all in different positions, perhaps, but just really focusing on planning, which is crucial to start. We might spend a bit of time on that, but also not losing sight of all the other legal compliance you might need to have and keep an eye on, and how that interfaces with this situation we're in, but also longer term plans. So very much when I talk about planning, when we go on to that section, it's very much the where are we here and now, whereas the longer term changes are all about what's your workforce looking like after we get over this next phase that we're in.
Okay, perfect. And also, sorry, I meant to add before, this is probably what I was going to say before I said, I can't remember what I was going to say. Obviously, you're all muted, everybody who's kind of attending, but if you have any questions at any point, or any comments, or anything that you'd like to say, you should be able to use either the Q&A or the chat section. So you know, do just jump on there if you've got anything to add or anything to ask. We'll also have about 15 minutes at the end for questions. Okay, cool. So the need to make a plan. Everybody loves a plan, right?
Yeah, I know, and you're probably, you know, I'm going to make a massive assumption here, and I hope I'm not too far off, but if there's anything we keep hearing at the moment, it's planning. Regardless of what you're looking at specialised wise, it's planning. Have you got a plan? Whether it be health and safety in terms of what you need to do around your risk assessments. I'll be saying it from HR perspective. So what I'm talking about here is really, where are you now with your business? And if we just use as an example, and this won't be for everybody, but over the next 3 months, what does your business look like? So before you even start to consider, oh, I want to bring Sid or Harry or Jane back, you know, it's really important that you look at what your business plan is first. And I'm sure you're all doing that already. I'm sure that many of you will continue to operate. And you're having to manage tight cash flow situations and that sort of thing. So really, what is it that your business is looking like? And are you clear about that? Because it's only then that you can identify, once you know where your business is heading, what does that look like in terms of your people plan? So if you've got people on furlough, or if you've got people working from home, it leads you to identify what are your critical functions. So from your critical functions will naturally fall out the roles that align themselves to those functions, and therefore the people that sit within those roles. And by going through that sort of approach, you're facing this objectively. And as we move on through this webinar, you'll be able to start to see even more so why that's so important in terms of objectivity and managing any potential legal risks around potential discrimination claims. So once you've identified that, then you're in a position where you're able to start sharing because by making changes, you need to ordinarily consult, and not least if you're using the flexible furlough scheme, you have to reach agreement as to placing people on furlough, like we did if you utilise the first scheme that was still under, but very rapidly we're approaching the flexible scheme, which is a completely new scheme. So it's a close down one, you almost have to then come to a new agreement for the first one. So by making all those plans, you need to make sure that as part of your decision making, it runs from your business needs into your people needs and how that might impact on their terms and conditions.
So it's worth just noting here, isn't it, that you know, the framework, the law, you know, other than the furlough scheme, the law hasn't actually changed. So you know, the framework that you're working within has this new bit, which is furlough and flexible furlough, but everything else is kind of the same. There's no sort of special exemptions or exceptions, are there? For
no, not really. I mean, they have put some exemptions in relation to the furlough scheme. So for example, SSP, you know, you can reclaim SSP now if it is that you if it's aligned to COVID, for example, whereas that's a different rule. That's the law changing. They've put in exceptions to that, similar to working time directive. So annual leave falls under working time directive. So they've put in provisions for you to be able to allowed to carry over statutory annual leave for a period of time over the next couple of years, for example. So that would be different to what you would have in your terms and conditions. But you're absolutely right, Victoria, because your terms and conditions and policies are things that are also connected with how you operate culturally. But on one hand, you're saying that's how we deal with things. But on another hand, we're in this situation, which is encouraging everybody to be a lot more flexible and to understand each individual employee's personal circumstances and add that flexibility. So when Victoria and me were talking before, I referred to it as brilliant leadership, because yes, it's important your managers are really clued up on what's in the policies and procedures, so you know what your normal practice is, but equally it takes brilliant leadership to be able to apply flexibility to the different scenarios you're now faced with, but still adhere to the law. So it does take a bit of imagination for some people's circumstances, and in turn you would expect and hope that you would have a flexible workforce back, and one that's engaged, ready to come back, so long as you've done everything in your power as a good employer.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So you have this, you have obviously the sort of legal framework, but which you obviously have to comply with. But what you've just said about sort of brilliant leadership and flexibility, it kind of works both ways, doesn't it? Because, you know, in a lot of ways, we're expecting employees to do an awful lot at the minute. You know, work from home, make these massive changes. You know, if you've got kids, then that's, you know, that's a whole other story. And it seems to me that, you know, if the schools do go back, for example, in September, and appreciate not everybody wants or can send the children back, you know, what kind of happens then? Like, I have this feeling that there's almost this movement now towards sort of let's get back to business as usual, but actually there just isn't the framework there for a lot of people to make that happen. So how can kind of law firm leaders almost balance that, you know, to make sure that they're being seen to be fair, equally that they're you know, they can optimize their business? Because we all know, I think we all accept that we have got some very tricky economic, you know, times coming up. So there's a real kind of conflict there potentially, isn't there, between being human and being a business leader? So what's the best way? Is there a way that they can approach that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's several ways they can approach it, but it does involve being really clued on the rules of the flexible furlough scheme, which are different to the existing furlough that we're in now, which is great because it does offer more flexibility to manage the things that you've just said, Victoria, recognising economy-wise and businesses are struggling. So when we first went into the furlough, there was no flexibility there. I had clients who say, well, I've got to put my staff on furlough, but actually I've got a little bit of work, but not enough to fill their time. So what do I do? Yeah. And then they weren't allowed to allow them to work 1 day a week. With this flexible furlough, it's you can allow your people, your employees, your team, to work as much as you've got available for them, and then place them on furlough for, say, 2 days a week. If they work full time, they might be working 3 days, and then you put them on furlough for 2 days, and that can be swapped and changed. Equally, if you've got people that have children who are in the year groups that haven't been identified to go back, or have got shielding issues in terms of related to health, obviously when we talk about policies, you've got your absence management policies, but you're having to be a lot more flexible because the furlough scheme allows you to furlough. So you might be able to agree with your employees that they can cover their children being at home if they've got a partner 2 days a week, and then it allows them to return to work in some capacity, and you continue to furlough them for the remaining period. That in itself, because you're almost doing it on an individual basis, depending on your workforce as to when you want to bring people back from home working or into a site, or lift furlough to return to home working. You know, there's a whole mix of things. So you're having to almost individually agree that. And in doing so, the most critical thing to get across to business owners at the moment is, within doing so, if you've got people on furlough on the current scheme and then you start altering that for the future, you need to reach a new agreement with them and put that into writing. So HMRC have that expectation for you. So if that's changing from week to week, whilst that's flexible, you're going to be holding a lot of discussions with your teams, aren't you, in order to do that, depending on the size of your teams. So yes, it is quite complicated, not least how you calculate it, and I'm not an expert on that. Victoria, I'll hold my hand up, so don't start asking me loads of questions.
I'm going to ask you to do some calculations, don't worry. I think
very complicated, especially if you're swapping and changing. If it's just the same all the way through, it's less complicated. But particularly as we start to reduce down what the entitlement is on flexible furlough, and if anybody would like the breakdown of that, I'm happy to supply that information. But for today, it's probably
jumping in on that. We've done with previous webinars, we have done sort of quite nice giveaways and checklists and things. So
yes,
we could
I'm happy to do that. Yeah, super.
Okay.
Yeah,
we'll send that to all of you, unless anybody says they definitely don't want it. But
yeah, and the other link I would suggest, because I'm the person that likes to give. So if there's stuff that you can tap into yourselves and make good use of, the ACAS code around how furlough works and how you pay it, and what almost like frequently asked questions, is really very good. Just remember, ACAS organisation is about good practice, and the government do look closely to that. But if you really want to question certain things, sometimes it's good practice rather than a legal position. So it's always useful to tap into some further guidance if you needed it.
Fab. So I have the two sort of things have just come up, just popped up into my brain as you were talking then. So I've got kind of two questions. So you've talked about brilliant leadership, you've talked about the flexibility and kind of the need for that on both sides. And then you went on and we also talked about the fact that you're essentially kind of consulting with probably many people in well, potentially lots of people in your law firm, potentially all of whom might be doing different roles. You'll have men, you'll have women, you'll have people with children, you'll have people with caring responsibilities, you could have people who are shielding. Is there an opportunity there to kind of engage then? You know, is this actually a really nice opportunity to kind of re-engage your workforce and just, you know, make sure that they are feeling loved, you know, essentially in what's been a really quite a difficult period for most of us, if not all of us?
Without a doubt. I mean, we talk about communication generally, don't we? And there's no more important time to do that right now because of the situation we're all in, have never faced before. I'm repeating probably what we all feel and think, but with reference to, if you've got groups of people in different places, whether that be home working on furlough, one of the just very practical things is have a weekly Zoom, or how often is reasonable. You might do as an overall, it depends on the size of your organisation, you might do that by department, but it's about nothing should be a shock. That's what I always say, unless of course you're talking about a completely different process for different reasons. But where we were talking about at the moment about this COVID-19 situation, the impact it's had on business, it's about keeping in touch with your employees. And by doing so, if it is that you're thinking along some lines of, actually, if I use, for example, forgive me if this is not relevant to you, but if you've got wills and probate at the beginning of COVID-19, they might have been absolutely hell for leather in terms of busyness. That might have died down a bit now, and you might find that your property and conveyancing sections from a legal point of view are really getting, since the restrictions have been lifted.
I think it's probably likely to be the opposite way around, and I had the real urge to make a deeply inappropriate joke then around wills and probate, but I am avoiding doing that.
Right, okay. But it's interesting because, yeah, well, yeah. So it is interesting though, but what I've heard through some of my contacts is properties going through the roof, you know, as we stand at the moment. So what I'm trying to demonstrate is you might have had, at the beginning of COVID, you might have had one department that was particularly busy, another department less busy. So by having the conversations with your workforce, it might be that you're getting people who are really keen to come back to work. They've missed the team side of things from a health and wellbeing point of view. They might work in a finance role in a particular department, and they might say, well, actually, I don't mind moving over to another section if you've got staffing difficulties there, if more people have got restrictions that they can't work around, like children or health issues, or high levels of absence. So, you know, it's opening those conversations. Often the ideas and suggestions can come from the team, but equally, if you're then needing to carry out fundamental changes that you need to more formally consult with, at least you've signposted it and given some opportunity to input.
It's that flexibility point, isn't it? You know, flexibility and communication. If you get that right, you're probably going to be okay, aren't you?
Yeah, and I always say to people that I'm working with, a lot of the time I'm amazed about the number of business decisions that are generated for fear of upsetting one or two individuals. And I always encourage people, take your people out for a minute and work out, what do you want your business to look like? What are your business needs? And then work out your people plans from that. And if there are, generally speaking, people want to do the right thing and want to come to work and deliver a good job. So it's only ever one or two out of every 20 or 30 that you might have some difficulties with, and most of the time you can get over those. But in the event that you can't, there are always ways available to you to help you manage that through.
Yeah. Okay. I can't remember what the next slide is. I think, do I need to move on to the next slide now? I think yeah. Compliance. So just before we move on to compliance, because I do think you're going to cover this, it was just my second question. The legal profession tends to employ a lot of women. Let's not get into the kind of the fact that so many women go into the law but so few are partners. That's a conversation for another day. But it does strike me that in making these decisions, particularly if you have, you know, a board that is made up of sort of middle class white men, which, you know, tends to be the case. Let's not comment on that now. There's the potential, isn't there, for discriminatory decisions to be made, possibly intentionally, but probably not, probably just through assumptions that, you know, can happen if you have a board that looks exactly the same in terms of its makeup. What would be your suggestions for sort of making sure that you stay on the right side of the law, particularly with regards to discrimination?
So if I give you an example of the things that people are facing at the moment, if you're looking to lift furlough or apply some flexibility to that, make sure you're not in a position where you make assumptions. So you might lift furlough for a male member of the team, regardless of what level that person is, and keep somebody who you know has children or responsibilities on furlough, and they might take umbrage to that. They might say, well, actually, you're only keeping me on furlough because I'm female. You haven't asked me about this at all. You've assumed, therefore, that the males should come back to work, and that's not fair. So it's those sorts of things that will open you up. Even if that wasn't your intention, you might have a completely valid reason, but you would need to make sure that you're able to back that up. So when we talked at the beginning about your decision making and your business plans, what you need in where in terms of critical functions and what roles fall out of that, as part of that is then what process do you put in place to that if you did receive challenges, you can demonstrate that you'd followed a consistent process with all your team. And so, for example, I supplied yesterday just a very simple template, not chapter and verse, with some key questions that the client was going to use for all of his team to make sure that it covered all the things from a health and well-being point of view, just to personal circumstances that they're willing to share, and what they are and aren't willing to do. And if you get to the point where you've got so many people with the same role doing the same or similar role, and you only need half of them to come back, it's about having some selection criteria about how you base those decisions, and keeping a record of that.
Yeah. So again, it's talking to people, isn't it? You know, it's funny. I said this to you when we were doing the run through yesterday. You know, there comes a point, I think, in every single one of these webinars where we're like, it's just communication, isn't it? And it's like, yeah, it is just communication. You know, if you get your communication right, there are frameworks that you need to follow and methodologies and, you know, all the rest of it. But communication is just so important, isn't it?
It is, and with the communication, it's not what you're doing, it's how you're doing it. So we've heard that as well. Don't want to sound like a cliche there, but it's true. And it's very much a case of do your homework, have your knowledge there, because a lot of your confidence as a leader and how you're managing this through will come from the knowledge. You know what you're talking about, so you know what the parameters are in terms of what you can and can't do, in order to then apply how flexible you can be or can't be.
Yeah, and get help as well. You know, there's no, you know, I completely realise that, you know, times are tough at the minute, and that cash flow is, you know, really critical for all of us, for every single lot of them, whether you've got a CBILS loan or whether you've, you know, got enough cash to kind of sit it out. But I don't know. I always think with something like, you know, HR provision, just get it right to start with. You know, it's far better to chuck 500 quid at it now than like 10 grand 6 months down the line.
Yeah, and I agree with that, and I'm not because I'm in the trade, but because actually there's nothing more frustrating than seeing what it is a business is trying to do for all the right reasons, and then they get caught up on process because your risk is already started, and then you have to go backwards and try and undo some of that. That's seriously frustrating for somebody like me, because actually I want clients to be in a position of strength, and hopefully by doing so they engage their workforce, even if they're having to carry out some actions that we'll cover later in the webinar that's quite difficult.
Yeah, okay, cool. Shall we look at more detail at the sort of specifics of what you think or what you have identified as being particular touch points legislation wise?
Okay, before we just go into this, there's one really, really key point, and hopefully your payroll and your accountants might be on this already, and if they are, great, but if they're not, at least I've done, because my intention is always try and give stuff to people that they can take away and look further if they need to, is around HMRC. So the first furlough scheme, for example, at the beginning they were saying that it was needed to agree with your employees and put it in writing the specifics around how the furlough will work. There was also the thought process that you were having to go as far as to get employees to write back to confirm their acceptance of that. At the beginning, that's what was needed. And then as because this is a moving feast, really, they then come back and confirm, no, you don't need to go that far to get employees to write back. But with reference to the new furlough scheme, if you're going to a different arrangement, and if you then swap and change, you need to make sure you're reaching new agreements and populating that in writing. And I'm not saying you have to go through lengthy, wordy documents. I'm saying be practical about it, make sure it's confirmed in writing to each individual employee. But along with that, this is the important bit that people may not be aware of, there is real requirement to hold your records. So, and this is a HMRC thing, but from an employment point of view, I always make sure I cover it as well. That if you are, say for example, you employ me and I come back from work full time and I come back 2 days a week and you keep me on furlough for 3 in week 1, but then you swap it around in week 2, you've got to keep accurate records of exactly what you're paying versus what you're claiming on furlough, particularly as it scales down. So when it goes from 80% to 70% and that sort of thing as the months go on. And also you need to be aware of when you need to make the claims. So they're encouraging month by month claims, but you know there may be an opportunity for you to put in the hours that you think you're going to need, and if it is that you don't need those hours, you can obviously adjust that the following month. If you don't put in enough and you say, actually I didn't put in enough and I want to claim back for more hours, that's more difficult to do. And you'll have more hoops to jump through. So it's just a tip there that you really need to look at how much detail, and I know this is sort of stepping out of my arena now, but it's how much detail you need to record, because with reference to the agreement to put people on furlough, you have to keep that for 5 years. With reference to your records of exactly what hours they worked, what they were paid, whether that was paid hours from yourselves, whether they took leave during that period, how you made up that leave, that has to be kept for 6 years. So I just wanted to point that out because this is moving and more information is becoming available.
Yeah. I reckon most lawyers probably keep things for at least 7 years for litigation reasons. If anybody thinks that's correct, maybe put a comment. I know I certainly keep things for 7 years. The former lawyer in me is like, you might still get sued. 6.5 years ago, but you might still get sued.
Yeah, I know, it's really to make it aware for people with reference to the data protection side of things, because obviously your retention period, you need to be able to justify the length of time. So I'm just pointing that out so that
I think that's really useful. Somebody's just come back and said correct, so here we are. We have at least one who keeps things for 7 years. I'm glad it's not just me, although I'm not a practicing solicitor, obviously. No, I think that's really helpful. Does anybody have any questions actually on the flexible furlough scheme, or anything kind of relating to what we've talked about so far? If you have, feel free to stick something in the group chat, or indeed on the Q&A section. But yes, we were going to talk about legislation, weren't we?
Indeed. So really, it was just to watch out for. So during this time, we've already started seeing some changes. So for example, the watch outs are if you've got a situation where you've got lots of people working from home at the moment, we can expect to see flexible working applications go up. So again, I've started to receive some calls about that to say, well, how do I manage that? And in light of what you were just saying, Victoria, about opening to potential discrimination claims, if it is that you've got well, it doesn't make any difference actually, men or women work in the workforce that have got childcare responsibilities, how do you, if you can only afford to agree certain number of flexible working applications under normal circumstances, and you never thought a situation like this could work so well at home, some employers might be open to actually we can continue this arrangement longer term, or balance it a little bit to a little bit of working in the office, a little bit of home working. But if everybody wants a bit of that, how do you manage that? And so there's a flexible working statutory process that you would follow that would gear you through how you would manage that. But equally, if you've got everybody who's able to flex, and you can only agree some of them because you want to have a need to have a presence in the office, how do you measure that? How do you make some decisions around that? And ultimately, there's no easy answer to that if it is that your criteria, because there's 6 main reasons for agreeing flexible working that you need to consider, if you're refusing under. But ultimately, you might come down to first come, first served. And that in itself has knock-on effects, because you might have one employee who is good, yeah, and works well, who submits an application, and then 2 months later somebody else submits an application and you really want to keep hold of them but you can't agree it. Yeah. So that in itself brings dilemmas for employers. So that's something to watch out for. That's the top one. Also absence management. So this is all clearly all around absence management, health and well-being in the workforce. So if people had underlying health issues anyway, you need to make sure that it's even more robust what you're doing, and that you've got awareness of as far as you can in terms of your managers are trained up to how to actually deal with that, so you're not subject to any disability discrimination claims, even more so around making reasonable adjustments. So from that point of view, that's important. If you were going down a redundancy route in the future, and you were needing to consider that, and I know we're going to touch on that next, but in terms of legislation and watch outs for, if you're going through redundancy consultation during time when you've got employees on furlough, it is likely to be deemed as a reasonable adjustment, a reasonable measure, when you're looking at redeployment, to allow people to keep being furloughed to delay the redundancy. So it's having an awareness of those sort of things, just similarly to if you have a situation where you've returned people into a workplace and people aren't adhering to the social distancing rules, you might find that you've got conduct issues or grievances because somebody feels unhappy that despite being mentioned 3 times, that person's not been dealt with, or perceived that that person's not been dealt with. So there are lots of things in the background, legislation-wise, that while this is all going on, don't forget you still have all those responsibilities to make sure that you follow through with those correctly. And the added risk that's associated because of COVID-19, it becomes much more serious from a health and safety point of view if you can't demonstrate you're managing those things well.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. There's a lot to think about, isn't there, and there's a lot to balance. I think at the minute, but there's a lot as well that's going to be kind of unpredictable. You know, what kind of happens next, and it's that's part of why this has been and continues to be so difficult, isn't it? You need to plan, but it's quite hard to plan when you don't really know what you're planning for.
And that's why at the start of the presentation, when I was saying working out the workforce plan, some organisations can clearly see well into the future, but generally speaking, for smaller businesses, that might not be as clear. So if we take Chewy, for example, was it 8,000 jobs? How long ago did they announce that? And we were only part way through COVID. Now I know travel is really hit, and they probably are finding it easier to see what the longer term looks like then. So they will carry out action now. But for a lot of other organisations, depending on the industry you're in, you don't know yet because it's a wait and see thing, which is why it's important to do what's your workforce shape looking like now in terms of what you know over the next 2 or 3 months. And then as you do that, you'll and come towards the end and keep building up over time, it's really critical that you evaluate that. So you might be speaking to your team, so how's it going? You continue to work from home, you might find productivity goes up, you might quite like that. But it's about how you maintain your team relations and that sort of thing. So you might find that actually you're getting closer to saying, well, actually, there's one part of our business that's thriving. We want to build on that, whereas another isn't so much. So that's where your longer term planning comes into play.
Yeah, okay. So, part 2 of the plan.
Yes, so really, we've already started to touch on redundancy and see a situation through the media where a lot of companies, unfortunately, have started to announce redundancy. So it's inevitable that's going to carry on. But if you're in that situation where you're starting to look and see what your shape of your workforce is going to be longer term, it's about having early discussions about what the alternatives will be. So, you know, it's very much a case of if I think of the worst case scenario and you find that you have taken some action and the employees are not happy with it, and I don't know, for example, if you're unionised or not, but let's assume for a minute you're not. But if you go through a process and you've got 1 or 2, it only takes 1 or 2 tribunals, and the cost of even preparing to defend those can be quite substantial. You need to almost look back and know what it is you would need to do to ensure that you're minimising your risk now. So if it is that you're looking at changing people's roles, if it's that you're looking at, actually, I've got to cut the amount of staffing I have, and you're looking at redundancy, there is a whole process to follow. But prior to that, the government have put this furlough scheme in, currently sitting at a contribution of 80% for employers, to try and either prevent redundancies or delay them. So a few minutes ago, I said in an example that when you're having to consult around redundancies, one of the measures that you're likely to be expected to do is when you look at redeployment. So when you look at, actually, I need to remove this role, but I might have a need over in a different part of the business for something that this person could be matched to. So you would go through and you might redeploy them into that area. Similarly, as a similar support mechanism, it would be viewed that actually, if you could keep them on furlough for as long as you can to delay that redundancy, that's been encouraged. So for some people, you would have had what's known as layoff built in your contract. And if the government hadn't put furlough in, then that's what a lot of people would have been doing. In fact, some people did that anyway. But the thing is, it's about preventing redundancy. So there might be other things that you can look at as part of your longer term workforce transformation to avoid redundancy as a last resort. And the sort of things you can look at is reducing people's hours, reducing pay. You might have a bonus scheme in place, freeze recruitment in other areas if it is that one area you particularly need more people, because actually that could be possible redeployment options. Withdraw offers that you've might made, which isn't ideal, particularly if you think you found an ideal candidate. So there are all sorts of things you could do that would require you still to consult and reach agreement with the workforce, but actually might either prevent you having to make redundancy and job losses, or reduce down the number you're having to make. And all of this is with keeping your reputation intact as well, because if you're needing to make redundancy, I'm mindful of always trying to think, what's your brand? How does that affect your branding in terms of your reputation?
Oh, completely. I mean, some we know of some firms, who literally kind of made whole teams redundant, right at the very start. And no, I'm not judging them on any level. That might have been literally the difference between a firm that continues and one that doesn't. To get that, but you're right. Reputationally, if you are seen to have done this to just sort of sack people wholesale, it's not just bad for your kind of reputation amongst your clients, but you might also, further down the line, when all of this is over and when we start to have the economic recovery, which will come, are you then buying yourself? Are you then getting yourself into a problem with trying to attract staff? Because if you are seen as sort of cutthroat and you sack people as soon as bad things happen, do people want to come and work for you? Who knows? Possibly not. And then actually the knock-on of that is you probably have to increase your wages and increase other, add other benefits, because you're just not seen as somewhere that's particularly attractive to work, potentially. So you're right. The reputational side of all of this, and not just redundancies, but how you are treating your staff, because people talk, and Manchester in particular is not a big legal market in the sense that everybody knows each other, everybody gossips about each other. You've got to be careful, haven't you?
Absolutely, because you just, like I say, it takes one or two, not even two, it takes one. And particularly if you're a very community-based business, and have been going for a number of years, you've worked so hard to develop that business, and then you have one scenario which, in itself, even if you're having to make redundancies, I've been through a terribly handled redundancy, you never forget it. So people do talk about things, and once you've been through something like that, you do your damnedest to make sure that nobody ever goes through that again, because it can be quite damaging. So it's very important that if you do have to get to a situation where you do redundancy, there's all sorts of things that you can build in there. And it doesn't have to be high cost. It can be time intensive rather, absolutely. But there are things you can build in there to do that as kindly as possible, to keep your reputation and your culture intact, your values. Because you're leaving for, even if you're only getting rid of one or two people, you've still got your existing team who are going to be feeling things as well. So it's really important not to lose sight of that.
Yeah, no, I completely get that. It's tough, isn't it? You know, if you are having to face you know, getting rid of people, reducing your team, I think sometimes people can forget in the kind of the process of doing it that, you know, they're focused very much on the people who are actually outgoing, which, you know, is understandable. Reputationally, yes, you should treat people kindly, and you should, as far as you can, treat them well, even if you are dismissing them. But actually, it's the team that's left that then really needs a lot of TLC, isn't it? Kind of reassurance. And I don't know what you think about this, but for me, again, that communication thing is openness. You know, I always think that if you as a firm can be very open in terms of, you know, what you're trying to achieve and why you've taken a certain step, and, you know, even go as far as, I wouldn't have a particular issue with, you know, releasing financial information, but I know that's a bit taboo for some, for lots of firms. But again, it comes down to that idea of why, you know, why have you created this firm? What are you trying to achieve? And, you know, what's your culture all about? What drives you? You know, quite basic things, but things that perhaps people just forget to talk about.
Yeah, I think it's people, you need to consider the cost of not doing that. So everything might seem fine on the surface, but if you're an organisation that seems to, which is why the planning is so important, because if you keep changing the plan and you're going through several rounds of redundancy and changes, it makes it even more unsettling for people, and people vote with their feet. And I know unemployment has, well, it's gone through the roof, hasn't it, at the moment? Yeah. But you only have to look at, we start talking about reputation, look at, was it Glassdoor? Somebody correct me if that's wrong, but Glassdoor, people are very vocal with their feelings now. So when people get up and running, you don't want to lose your good people, because good people will get approached. And so it's about sustaining that within your business, really.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Okay, so we've talked about the first part of the plan. We've talked about the kind of the legal framework and the things to be aware of, and then we've talked about, you know, once your plan's been in progress for a little while, you know, how to kind of review it, particularly the redundancy side of things. Anything else to say about, you know, that sort of stage 2 of the plan?
Just to say, if you're looking like you're going to embark on that, build in the time, because you might have heard floated around this term meaningful consultation, and particularly if you've got people that are union members or you're a unionised environment, you might have already elected representatives in your workforce. So you might have, and we go back to the policies and procedures again, you might have existing policies and procedures where you make certain commitments if in the event that you're going to have to reduce down your staffing levels through agreement with those parties. So don't lose sight of that, allow enough time for it, because depending on how many people you're putting at risk, and it depends whether you've got multi-sites or not, or different types of businesses, as to whether or not they're recognised by separate establishments, and therefore numbers of people that could be put at risk. Because obviously when you start going into higher numbers, there is a requirement to consult, and that can take you, 45 days, or it could be taken 30 days. And then on top of that, you have to apply notice as well. So it can take a long time just to work through, and obviously you need all the costs associated with that. So usually if you're facing that type of scenario, you put on your experts in terms of your HR lead, whoever that is, and your finance people as well as your operational, to see if you can come up with a almost like a communication and consultation plan that perhaps covers all of those things, so that you can try and make it as seamless as possible. That might sound ridiculous, but I hope you understand what I mean by that. Minimising the impact on your business.
Yeah, no, completely. Okay. So I don't think we've got massively ages to summarise it, but how would you sort of summarise what we've talked about in maybe kind of 3 points?
Okay. Be as flexible as you can. So remember, it's a two-way street. It's not a black and white situation. There's got to be plenty of grey around this. Treat your policies and procedures as a framework. Try not to use them as a Bible, because it will restrict down your flexibility. Do your homework in terms of understanding if you've got business decisions you need to make, which is great, the fact that you're clear about those, because that's the expectation. Your employees will want to be confident around what it is that you're saying, but be clear on the rules around certain things, so you know what you can and can't do, and you know what you can and can't agree to, and that will put you in a much more confident place. And if you're returning more people you might have lots of people on home working at the moment, and that's great. If you're wanting to return people to site, just make sure you've done your risk assessments and all of that. I know that last week you had health and safety.
Yeah, we talked about risk assessment. Yeah, so if anybody missed that, or if anybody kind of hasn't thought about how to bring people back safely, kind of from a physical perspective, then yes, I'd strongly suggest you go and watch that webinar.
Okay, and so if you commit certain things, follow through with them, so that you don't then have to back up or be challenged on different things, because you'll recognise not everybody's the same. So some people will be more anxious than others for legitimate reasons, and some people might be resistant for other reasons. So be consistent but actually flexible at the same time. That sounds like that doesn't make sense in some ways, but yeah, it's just about applying flexibility, doing your homework, knowing what you're talking about, so that it gives you directions to move in. And don't be frightened of trying new things. So listen to your team, because often they can come up with more ideas, because who knows what your new norm's going to look like. And some of those things hopefully will be really positive, and I really hope they are for businesses.
So be flexible, be prepared, and be consistent. Super. Okie doke. Ah, thank you. Anybody got any questions? Anybody got any burning questions as a result of that absolutely fantastic introduction to bringing your staff back post-COVID or mid-COVID? I'm not quite sure where we are. Probably mid-COVID, aren't we still? Unfortunately. I mean, if anybody does have any questions, then obviously they're not. We're not going to kind of read out your names or anything like that. We're not going to share who is asking questions. So do feel free to put them in the Q&A.
I love questions as well.
Say again.
I love questions as well.
You love questions, yeah. I love good questions.
I mean, on a different point, we mentioned about documents. I said about the ACAS link. Yeah. Which I can make available to Victoria. But if there are, if people would like a table outline of how the flexible furlough will work with reference to the reduction of the grant, it'd be just useful to get a bit of a hands up or down or whatever to whether or not that would be useful. So I'm happy to supply that following this webinar, if it to be sent out via Victoria, if that's something people think is useful.
Just trying to set up a poll. Okay, I'll just set up a poll quickly. So what are you offering? So really, if are people clear about, would they find a table of the furlough and how, or got one, yes please, how it's reducing down over the coming months, how that would work, anything useful there? Yeah. I've got another question here. So, and just really links to like ACAS website. Plus I've got a template that I mentioned yesterday I prepared for a client who is holding conversations with their team, which has got sort of the typical questions you'd like to ask, because that allows you to document, that might lead into your written documentation of how them coming back into the office or going back on furlough works. So if there's anything like that people would like me to share, I don't mind, that's fine. Okay, so I've posted the poll. I know one of you has replied already, so that's great. And then we've had a question, hooray! Do you anticipate an increase in HR issues like grievances as people come back feeling more stressed / anxious? Yes, because I've already had a couple of bordering on, and in fact I've picked up 3 mediation cases this week that stems from grievances because emotions have been running high during this time. So yes, do anticipate that. So when we covered the watch outs legislation wise and being clear on what your policies commit to, and so with reference to those, that's why it's so important with reference to talking to your teams and understanding if you've got some resistance to people coming back into the workplace, what's driving those things. And if it is that people legitimately have had an underlying health issue, then it's about coming up with flexible ideas about what is it that's really bothering them about it, but what can you do to support them back into work. So it might be that you move their desk. It might be that you
you show them the risk assessment. It might be that you encourage them to come in to the office for a meeting and see for themselves what it looks like. Do you see what I mean? So it's about putting things in, anticipating and understanding where people are at, and listening out for things that might be grievances, because people don't have to put something in writing for it to be a grievance, but you can usually start to see the direction it's going in order to put some prevention in there and try and understand those things. If, however, somebody has quite liked been on furlough and they don't really want to, there's work for them to do now, so you want them to homework, but they've got kids at home that they want to homeschool, and they're not willing to be flexible, and they're just refusing to come into work if you need them to be office based, you might have a conduct issue there. So there's going to be a whole host of things that could happen, but yes, I do anticipate a number of grievances. So it's worthwhile, if you've got consistent processes in how you're dealing with staff, communicating with staff, and documenting things that I can't emphasise enough, then hopefully that will narrow down the risk of grievances being raised, because it takes up a lot of time when you get into formal processes.
Okay. So yeah, people seem to want the table, so obviously we can put that together. Now, just remind me, what was the what else was it that you offered, and I'll put that out on the poll.
I'll email you just the link to the ACAS side of things that's got some typical question and answers. So there will be loads of things coming up, I'm sure, like what if I return to work and I feel unwell? I don't know if anybody's had these sort of things happening at the moment. Will I be safe? Asking you what measures you put in, and quite often, what if I can only commit to certain hours? So quite often those typical questions and answers are available on the ACAS website as to how to best manage that and what the rules are around what you can and can't agree to. So I'll send that over to you, Victoria, at the same time as I supply you the table of furlough.
Perfect. So yeah, if you don't mind sharing that information, we'll get that out to attendees. That would be super. And I think we're just about done, aren't we there?
I think Claire's just said, could she have the sort of template of questions that managers might use as a bit of a format, a table format, to when they're meeting staff or staff asking staff to come back into a base? Yes, I can make that available as well. If I supply them to you, Victoria, and that's useful.
Yeah, no, that's.
I'll be able to get that across early next week. I've just got a commitment tomorrow that takes me away. I will get that over to you as soon as
really busy, but yeah, no. So in terms of what we'll do now is, it usually takes us around a week to turn around the recording and get it up onto YouTube and onto our website. And then at that point, we usually email everybody who's been and sort of send them the assets, so the information you're kindly going to provide, and a copy of this if they need it. Yeah, thanks Mary. It's been, I hope everyone else has enjoyed it. I found the session really useful, really insightful, and sort of lots of practical tips and takeaways there, I think.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure. If it helps, I just hope that there's one or two things that people can take away, and if that isn't the case and you know it, then it's even better that you're already there, really. So I hope you don't feel it's not been a good use of time if that's the case.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it's been a great use of everyone's. Oh, hang on, is this a Q&A? Oh no, that's a thank you. Oh well, thank you as well. Yeah, again, just to say thanks for your time, Mary, and look forward to kind of getting this information and sending it out to everybody. And yeah, hope we see our current audience again very soon.
Thank you everybody.
Thanks a lot. Bye everyone. Bye.